Oh, you need to unmute, Susanna, sorry.
There we go. And I'm going to click got it because it's telling me I'm being recorded. Um, yeah, thank you, Ibi. That's that's one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. Um, and welcome everybody. It's really great to see so many of you here this evening on a Wednesday evening. It's getting dark outside. Welcome to my music room in North Yorkshire. Where you'll see a slightly chaotic arrangement of books and music behind me. Um, so if you get a bit bored with what I'm saying, you can always try and work out what the what's on the shelves there. But just to put you out of your misery, in case you spend the whole evening wondering what this is Fry, and he's in his Christmas get-up. And he's used in my teaching, so I'm afraid he suffers quite a lot of abuse. Anyway, so he's there, and now you know who he is. And I'd also like to, well, thanks to Ibi for hosting the evening and also for being very helpful in setting it up. I'm a bit of a novice at this kind of thing. Thanks to Mary for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks to the Viola da Gamba Society. It's a wonderful opportunity for me and an honour to be here. Now, when Mary first asked me to give this technique class, I have to say I was a little apprehensive, shall we say. I wasn't sure whether to say yes because I have no experience in giving an online presentation like this. I've never seen so many people on screen all at once. And so I was, shall we say, a little nervous about it. But then I thought, well, what could I present? What could I offer? And so my sort of hesitance and apprehension led me to think, what's another situation that leads me to feel somewhat anxious? And that is the whole sort of anxiety and all the things that are bound up when you realise that you have the first note on the page and you are alone when you're starting a piece of contrapuntal music. So this is what I decided to do. I decided to say yes to a situation which I anticipated was going to make me nervous and to talk about something which makes me nervous. So imagine if you're here today and you're intrigued by this possibly means that you have experienced this at some point, this anxiety bound up with playing a note from silence all on your own. And how many consort sessions have you been in where you hand out the music and then a plaintive voice says, "Do I start?" And then everyone says yes, and then you're on the spotlight and you have the responsibility of playing that first note and getting the piece off to a good start. And it's not always a very comfortable feeling. So this evening I thought I would talk a little bit about coping strategies. Having been through that situation countless times myself, I thought it was something that I would be in a good position to share with you, and how to cope with the stress and the anxiety, and how to get the piece off to the best possible start under the circumstances. So the first thing I think to address is what happens at that moment when you realise it's you. And our bodies are designed to cope with stress. We have a physiological response to stress. So in that split second, what will happen is that your body will release stress hormones, adrenaline and other ones, adrenaline possibly being the one most of us know about. And this release of stress hormones causes the fight or flight response. And the magnitude of this depends very much on the situation. So you might be in your regular consort playing session with all your closest friends. in a comfortable setting and you realise you've got to start the fantasy, and there might just be a little frisson of anxiety, or you might be totally calm, it's fine, but you might just get a little, oh gosh, feeling, or you might be in a situation where you're playing with new people who you haven't met before, in which case there might be a little bit more anxiety involved. You might be playing in a tutored session, in which case there might be even a little bit more anxiety involved. I remember my first tutored session with Alison way back when, and I was terribly nervous, so I know that feeling very well. And then, of course, on the concert platform, when it's just potentially very, very scary indeed. So those are the sort of degrees of magnitude, and I would defy anyone to say they haven't experienced at least something of that at some point. And what happens when the stress hormones kick in is that your heart rate increases, your breathing becomes more rapid and shallow, you might feel sweaty, you'll recognise all the symptoms of it. But the fight or flight response is obviously something that's very hardwired and probably dates back to when we were hunter-gatherers, and it's a response to a threat. And fight or flight doesn't seem like a very appropriate response to starting a piece of 17th century counterpoint. So how do we circumvent that desire to either fight or run away, which our bodies are essentially gearing us up for? So I think one of the first things to think about is how you persuade yourself to stay put. You're not going to run away, even though your muscles are gearing up and your breathing's gearing up, you're getting oxygenated blood around your body ready to be very active in response to this stress. So grounding, for me, at all times when I'm playing the viol, one of the most important things is to be aware of your points of contact, the points that make you stable. So the points of contact with the floor and the points of contact with the chair that you're sitting on. So essentially when we're sitting down, we go from being two-footed creatures to six-footed creatures because we've got the four, assuming we have four legs on our chair and our own 2 feet. And keeping the weight-bearing points of our feet on the floor is fantastically helpful for making you feel stable. And I know when I played the bass, I used to lift my heels off the floor or maybe tilt my feet to one side. And when I realised I didn't need to do that, I remember the feeling of literally feeling grounded and more stable. So the fight or flight muscular tension is likely to make you pull up and in, and your feet possibly come off the floor. I've taught people who are very relaxed when they're not playing, but as soon as they start playing, their heels just slightly come off the floor because that tension creeps in. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. And if you can organise when you're playing the bass to particularly think of your heels on the floor. Also, it's useful to think of your feet, if you can, being under your knees or slightly forward of your knees, not too much far forward. If you experiment now, as you sit on your chairs, it doesn't matter whether you've got an instrument, or it's perhaps even better to put your instrument down. If you can just think of where your feet are in relation to your knees and be aware of those contact points of your feet on the floor, particularly heels. So get yourself in a position where your heels feel that they can comfortably be in contact. And then just lift your heels slightly from the floor. Once you've got the sensation of the grounding of your feet on the floor, lift your heels up. Do you notice a little bit of tension creeping in, or muscular activity in your legs. And that's a muscular activity which would translate to the rest of your body. And what we don't want is tightness, anything preventing us from being able to move nice and freely with the actions that we need to play, i.e. in our arms. So once you release that, get your heels back on the floor, then that tension goes away. So even little movements like that, they sort of fly around the body because everything's interconnected. If you pull your heels back and bring your feet further back than under your knees, your heels come off the floor anyway. So that's why it's good to think of them under your knees. It's good to think about the height of your chair, because if you're on a chair that's not quite the right height for you, then again your heels might be tempted to come off. So don't try and correct the chair with your own physical use. It's really good to set ourselves up and then think about how we're going to hold the viol, rather than just picking up the viol and working with it. So grounding, that's your feet. Then the next point of contact with the chair is your sitting bones. Can you all feel sitting bones on the chair? The other thing that happens, actually, thinking about it, if you bring your feet back, if you bring them back towards the chair, not only do your heels come off the floor, but also it arches your lower back. And that again can cause some lower back issues when you're playing. So another argument for keeping feet under the knees. And you could just experiment thinking of gravity. Gravity is what's grounding us. Don't fight gravity. If you're in fight or flight mode, you're going to be wanting to get up and away. So you're probably wanting to go up away from gravity. So this is a refusal to respond to that stimulus. Thinking of sending your weight down through your sitting bones and through your feet. And I hope that by thinking of that, that makes you feel calmer and more secure. I mean, obviously you're all in the comfort of your own homes. You're not going to be feeling nervous right now. So it's not the best situation to be trying this out. But next time you are in that stressful situation, think about that grounding. So we talked about the muscular tension which the stress hormones create. The other thing that the stress hormones will influence is your breathing. And I always feel that breathing is terribly, terribly important. I mean, of course, it's keeping us alive. But it's amazing how we tend to forget about it when we're playing. And the time when it's most important is when you're coming in from silence. So during a piece, if you have a rest, that's a good opportunity to think, let's take a breath. But certainly before you start, being aware of your breathing is very, very helpful. And I would say for me, that has been the very, very most helpful thing. Because breathing not only releases tension, but it gets you into motion. And it's that movement which can really let go of any tension that might influence the sound you make at the beginning. Because I think the danger is with the fight and flight, we're like wound sort of coils. And so when we play, the coil gets unwound in a very tense way. So if we, again, with the grounding and the breathing, we're trying to resist that stimulus to run away. If I say to you, take a breath, I wonder what would happen. I'll share with you what I would instinctively have done before I had a bit of training in the Alexander technique, which is to take a breath like this. Do you see what's happening? It's a very active breath, and what I'm doing is tightening my chest and lifting my shoulders. Now, I imagine quite a lot of you are wind players or singers when you're not playing the viol, and you'll probably know a bit about breathing. But even so, you might have been taught things about actively taking a breath, taking in as much air as you can. That's not what this is about. This is about letting go of those tensions. And actually taking a breath is a misleading instruction. What we need to be thinking of is allowing a breath. So when we think of taking a breath, it's a physical activity. Whereas if you think of allowing a breath, what you're doing is letting your body do what it's designed to do, which is to take in air and release air. So now, as you're sitting here in your nicely grounded sitting position, if you start to just be aware of your breathing, and in particular, when you let the air out, let it out to the point where your body's reflex kicks in to take in more air again. So you're allowing that breath because the vacuum has been created, which then gets filled with the new influx of air. And what you might find as you do that is that you have a very different physical response to that breathing process. So rather than it being, it's just a gentle allowing and a gentle movement and expansion. And it's an expansion in three directions, because obviously as your diaphragm inflates, your ribs are designed to move. And your ribs not only move up and out at the front, but they will expand sideways and they will fill into your back as well. So what that's doing is sort of, you're a bit like a bellows. You're inflating out and back in again. And that's a lovely movement to set yourself up for playing. So I would say that's a very important thing to focus on and be aware of at all times when you're about to play, but also when you're feeling very anxious. Let's just think of that breathing process and sit just for a couple of moments and try that out, and be aware particularly of how it creates a tiny bit of movement in your arms. And now if you pick up your bow and maybe support the tip on the back of your hand, and do that same gentle allowing of the breath in and letting it out, and just be aware of how there's a tiny bit of movement potentially of the bow on your hand as you do that. And what's happening, I'm finding, is that as I breathe in, I'm expanding out, so the bow is moving away from the tip. I'm coming out effectively on a pull bow. And as I breathe out, I'm coming in on a push bow. And gradually you can start to enhance that movement with a bigger response to that breath coming in on the pull bow and then releasing out on the push bow. And you can breathe in through your nose and breathe out through your nose. Or if you imagine now that when you start playing, you're actually going to be producing a sound on that push bow, you might want to do something akin to what you would do if you were going to make a sound with your breath, i.e. if you're going to sing a note or play a note on a wind instrument. You might want to take that breath in through your mouth and release it through your mouth. And this all contributes to letting go of any tension that might be creeping in that moment of release of those stress hormones. Now let's think what might happen if we don't resist the stress hormones and we're still in fight or flight. If you imagine you're starting and you don't start with a movement, there's a lot of tension involved. And what I found, particularly in situations where I've been extremely nervous and on a concert platform, I've been thinking, okay, how am I going to start this? How am I going to start it? Shall I start with a pull bow? Maybe that's easier. Shall I start with a push bow? No, that might be easier. Shall I start with the bow on the string? That feels safer. That's better. And then what tends to happen is that because my bow's gripped the string, I am very tense and very tight because I can't move. And that gets me off to a bad start. So what I've found in recent years is that this gentle action of the breathing and the fact that I feel I can move is always important, that you can move and move in balance. So that means keeping your head, neck and back relationship and being able to move. The kinds of movement that aren't so helpful are when you do this kind of movement, because that's taking you off, or this kind of movement, that's taking you off balance. So what you want to do is try and stay connected with those sitting bones and stay in balance. Now, let's have a little look at the musical extracts. And if we look at the second extract, which is the Gibbons six-part fantasy, number 6. The reason I chose these 3 particular openers is because they've all given me problems at various times in my career. And in fact, when I was looking at the Law's Pavon, which is treble viol, very high, all on its own, only for half a bar, because the rest of the consort come in as a lovely warm support underneath, but the treble's so much higher than the rest of the consort, and it feels very fragile and very precarious. And I was looking at the score and I was getting cold sweats just looking at it. So you know, that's the degree of anxiety one can feel. The Gibbons that we'll just look at now is a tricky one. Have you all had experience of opening that fantasy? Yes, Elizabeth. It's hard, isn't it? Because you know, it's connecting the 2 notes, is then leaving them into, well, handing them over to the next person. It's a bit like a relay race. It's a tricky thing to do. And again, do you start with a push bow? Do you start with a pull bow? Blah, blah, blah. While we're thinking about what bow to start with, it's also worth saying at this point that before you start a piece, don't forget you can take time. There's no rush. No, everybody's got all the time in the world, so don't feel, oh gosh, everybody's waiting and they're all looking at me and I must get going, because obviously that's going to undo everything that will inhibit those stress responses. And just slowly scan through the piece, because you might want to make a decision about tempo. Just see what's coming up. If there's lots of quick movement, obviously you want to make sure you don't start too fast. And the other thing to say about the breathing is that the way you take in the breath will also give an idea of the tempo that you have in your mind to your fellow players. So if I think of starting this Gibbons fantasy, I'm going to look at what's in bar 2. Obviously the next part is in by bar 2, that's line 5, you are line 4. But still, you're very much at the top of that texture, and you might want to think, well, how fast would I like to play the next 2 bars? And if you take time also, you're more likely to give those first two notes their full value, because the danger is you might cut them a little bit short because of your anxiety. And the breathing will help with that as well. So if I'm going to start this fantasy, I am going to think about whether I come in from a little way above the string or whether I'm going to start with the bow on the string. If you do start with the bow on the string, you could maybe just keep it there just as security if you're feeling very anxious and you think your bow's going to shake. But as you take the breath, just lift it off a tiny bit and then it comes back into land again. And there's nothing to worry about starting off the string. If you've got the just coming a little bit off the string and you're coming into land with that breath and that movement. Is that clear? Can you see how that's working? If you start off the string and you come down like that, obviously your bow's going to bounce. So it's all to do with the trajectory. The other thing I should add also is that I find it very, very helpful when I'm starting a note to know that I've got control of the tip of the bow. And I often find it a little bit tricky if I've got a bow that I feel is too heavy. I find that hard. I like a lighter bow rather than a heavier bow. I feel I have more control over it. But certainly, even with a heavy bow, feeling like I've got control of you don't want to feel the tip of the bows. You can't tell it. You can't control it. That's not a good feeling. And with the bow hold, I find that my thumb position is a very important thing to monitor, because the thumb, I believe, the thumb counterbalances the tip of the bow. And you can experiment with that. Hold the bow, and wherever your thumb is now, slide it towards your first finger and see what happens to the tip of the bow. So if your thumb is a little too close maybe to the tip, you might find you haven't got quite as much control. And this is control in mid-air that we're talking about. It's feeling totally secure with your bow. So you can mess around with your thumb position and get a sense of how that can balance the tip, which makes it feel much more secure to risk just lifting the bow off the string and then starting that first note by gently engaging again with the string. Let's look back at the gibbons. And what you can try in your own time is the air viol version of this. So you've got your hand supporting the bow. Obviously, it's best to slide the stick of the bow along your hand so you don't get covered in rosin. And when you're ready, experiment with that action. And we're going to start with a push bow, see how that works. So if you think of allowing the breath in, that gets you into motion, and then we come into land as you breathe out. That's the first note. Now let's add on the next note. And you see that I'm aiming to actually use quite a lot of bow on that first note. And that's the other thing, that when we're feeling anxious, I think sometimes we can be rather conservative with the amount of bow we use, because it's, I don't know, we don't trust the sound we're going to make, or we just feel a little hesitant. But with that breath and that movement, just let it go. I find that once I've taken that breath, I just think, okay, what will be, will be. I'll bring my bow in to engage with the string, and then whatever comes out is fine. So try to let go of your inner critic as well when you get to that moment of releasing all that tension. Just go with whatever's going to come out. And then, once we've done the first two notes, if we've started on a push bow, of course, we've now got a minim rest to think, well, I'd like to actually have quite a lot of bow on the next note as well, note 3. So what I'm going to do with that is take that rest as an opportunity to take another breath and then come in to land again. So that's another moment of breath and release. If you start with a pull bow, which can sometimes seem like a safer option, that might encourage you to start a bit further up the bow, which gives you a little less bow on that first note, because it's a little bit hard to come into land down here. And then actually, I still think you've got to take the bow off the string to play the next note, obviously, because you're not going to stop that second semi-breve on the string. You're going to just take it off, hand over to the next person, and then... So we've got to feel comfortable with the bow not being engaged with the string. And now I'm going to pick up a viol and see if I can practice what I'm preaching. This example is also quite useful because whatever size of viol you're playing, we're all playing the same notes. So that means I don't need to mute, and you can play along if you wish to. Of course, all the entries in this piece, the entries are either E to A or A to D. So we're just looking at the very opening entry, which is E to A. And on a bass, it's a little bit more challenging because you're on the top string. On the tenor, it's much more comfortable. So if I play it to you now, and then we can try a few goes with everybody playing. So I'm going to let go of the anxiety which I'm feeling by taking that breath. Which I think went okay, because considering, I am actually feeling quite nervous, so I think I got away with that one. And the breathing really, really helped me, I have to say. So shall we try that? And I wonder whether we should, rather than me leading you in and doing it all together, whether I should just let you have a moment to try that out for yourself. Okay, we're getting on all right with that. Of course, you can start gently or you can start more strongly. I could have perhaps been a little bit more demonstrative with those first two notes. That wasn't so good. Second note was a bit of a crunch. But, whether it's a big movement or a slower bow speed, it's just to do with bow speed and arm weight. What I find terribly helpful as we connect the first note with the second is to slow the bow speed a little bit. So when I start the first note, I'm actually, I'm sort of just getting myself going. It's that thing of what will be, will be. But whatever speed I've started, probably reasonably fast to get a nice free sound on that first note. If I keep going at that speed, I'm going to run out of bow. So it's really helpful to control that change of the first two notes by slowing the bow speed down. And then keeping that second note going so that you really are handing over to line 5, so that that second note and the third note played by line 5 are beautifully connected. Let's now try doing that all together with me bringing you in, and that might illustrate that the action of taking a breath is also quite a good way of bringing in an ensemble. Because I think obviously there are pieces where everybody starts together, and how do we actually indicate if you're nominated to be the person that brings everybody in? Again, that's a position of responsibility too. And I think sometimes we think, oh gosh, how am I going to do that? And you take a big breath, and you do a big movement, and that's all actually going to detract from the focus, the physical mechanics of making a good sound. We don't want all this extraneous movement, or the breath that pulls us off away from our sitting bones. We want to stay grounded, and actually just taking that breath with that little bit of expansion and movement might be enough to indicate to everyone else what you've got in mind. So should we try that and see if by my breath and my movement it indicates to you not only when I'm starting the note, but also what tempo I'm thinking of. Let's play the whole extract. Was that clear? Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. Good. So that shows that it doesn't need to be a big movement, a big gesture to bring everybody in a collective way. Quite often I've been in recording sessions where we haven't been able to get the first note together, and then the recording producer has said, I actually want to hear you breathe. And which you sort of think, oh gosh, we don't want any extraneous noise, but actually being given the green light to take that breath together always cracks it every single time. So it's a really, really good thing to be aware of, that simply a breath is enough of an indication. And not only the person leading, but obviously everybody's got to take that breath, because we're all coming in from silence together. So that's, I think, probably all I want to say about that extract. I'm also aware that I want to allow time for you any questions that you have. So I just talk quickly about the treble viol one, which, as I said, brings me out in a cold sweat. So we're very high. Well, what I've done with this extract is I have put everybody's note on the same position on the fingerboard, which means we won't all be starting on the same note. So we're all starting on the 5th fret on the top string. And with this one, again, it may be nice just to sort of rest your bow on the string if you're feeling a little bit anxious, but then with the breath, make sure, again, you come into movement. So if you start with the bow on the string, don't get all tight and then, allow the movement. And then breathe and go. The other thing I should have said also is it's often worth just being aware of where you are in relation to the bridge when you start that note from silence. Because I think sometimes if we're um, just a little bit too close, it can make a slightly harsh sound. And then you think, oh, I didn't like that sound. And then obviously that's going to influence the way you play the rest of the phrase. So if a good default is to maybe err a little further from the bridge and then warm the sound by maybe when you think, oh, that's okay, now I can relax. And then you can maybe travel a little closer. If you're going to start quite far from the bridge, you can't have too much arm weight because it will do that. So it's just gently coming in, engaging with the string, and then relaxing and allowing the movement to unfold. And I think this is such a beautiful pattern, and it's such an exquisite opening. It's the sort of plaintive lone voice of the high treble. And I think, you don't need to worry about, oh, I've got to make it sound really rich and lovely, because it is that little vulnerable voice at the beginning of this piece. And the rest of the consort come in to say, it's okay. The challenge, of course, with this is that you've got a long note followed by a short note. So you've got to pace that long note a little bit carefully. But again, just thinking about bow speed, I like to slightly increase the bow speed as the other parts join. And you can actually use a fairly generous amount of bow on the minims as well to sort of gradually creep you back to the tip of the bow again. I will now, rather than muting, I just won't play. I'll let you spend a few moments getting to grips with that one. Obviously with the longer string lengths, you can't do the diatonic fingering, so you'll have to do a bit of a shift in there. Okay. So I think I should open the field for questions now, but just to summarise, really, I guess I haven't really said very much, because the key things for me are the grounding, making sure I feel comfortable before I pick up the viol, making sure I'm comfortable with the viol, making sure I'm resisting the fight or flight response by staying grounded and being aware of gravity. Another good thing that I find is helpful is to be aware of the space I'm in. If you think of the space that's behind you, it actually helps you to come into your back rather than being pulled forward. And also, if you're aware of your peripheral vision as well, that can really give you a sense of expanding, because the danger is that the fear brings you in, pulls you in and down, and what you want to do is come out and up. So that, the grounding and the breathing, I've found incredibly useful. And that's it, really. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Silence. I've got a question.
Dan.
For bass, I'm holding a bass, and I've got I'm just noticing, just looking at my feet, and I've noticed this with bass viol players that the left foot is often resting on its side with the sole off the ground. And I remember you saying earlier that it's helpful to have, you know, both feet, heels firmly on the ground. Um, do you have any suggestions on that? Any comments on how one should sort of adjust the feet? Because I think it's partly to do with, you know, avoiding the knee. It's a problem with the bass instrument. I find.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely what I used to do, and actually, when it was first suggested, I won't say who suggested it, that I try and keep my heels on the ground, my feet flat on the ground. I was a little hesitant and said, my first reaction was, I can't do that. No, that's impossible. But then I tried it and I thought, oh, actually, I can do it. It's partly the height of the chair. So if you're on a higher chair than is perhaps desirable, that actually sends the instrument lower, and you're more in danger of hitting your knee. It's really good to find a chair that works for you with your upper legs sort of roughly parallel with the floor, maybe a tiny slant down to the knee, but not too much slant down with the upper legs. When I'm starting beginners off with the bass viol, I sort of suggest that they start with their feet on the ground, and the idea of bringing the instrument into you from your desirable position where you're feeling you're in your optimum balance. I get them to slide their feet quite far apart and then put the viol in a position that they feel good about, where, you know, the angling's right, they're not going to hit their knee, and, you know, obviously that they're not having to avoid the scroll, or that basically they can keep their balance, and then bring the feet back in to engage with the instrument. And that's quite helpful because that is keeping the feet firmly on the floor, and maybe trying that can convince you that you don't need to roll the if you think of bringing your legs sort of around the instrument. I think sometimes maybe we let the hips flop too much as well, and that the hip flopping the leg away will send the foot onto the side as well. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think I find it's probably in my case. It's a tactic of lowering the left knee, so that I avoid it. It's something to do with I can't quite explain it, but it's something to do with how the viol is held and angled, that the bow misses the knee when the foot is resting on its side.
Yeah, I think that's because as you roll your hip outwards, I guess it will send the knee a little bit lower, won't it?
Yeah.
But actually, it's interesting when you do start by opening your feet out quite wide and then bringing them back together. The closer you bring your feet together, the higher the instrument sits. Mm. So maybe that's one solution, is to think of bringing your feet closer together.
I've got Thomas Monk here with a question, and also Virginia. Let's start with Thomas. Thomas.
Hi, Thomas.
Suzanne, what shape is your spine?
What shape is my spine?
Yes, because you're sitting about, how straight. I find that I'm afraid it's probably just old age. I tend to slouch and sort of wrap myself around the viol. And I find it sometimes that if you have a seat that slightly slopes forward, it makes your spine straighten up, and I feel I can open out a little bit. Also, in terms of breathing, any thoughts on what, should one be bolt upright, or even arching the spine backwards, or letting a little bit of slouch, or?
That requires a 3-year Alexander technique training. Actually, it's a really tricky one. Because also our perception of what we're doing is often, it's what's called faulty sensory perception. So you can think you're sitting bolt upright, but you might find if you look in a mirror, you're not. I'll just turn myself to the side, so you just see what I feel comfortable with. So what I'm thinking of is sending the weight down, making sure I can breathe. So if you collapse a little bit, it pulls your shoulders forward, which means it's less easy to bow because your shoulders can't function at their optimum, and also it compresses your upper body, which means you can't breathe as easily. So actually, if you think about the breathing, it can sometimes help. It's just a bit like a a tire pump or something. It can literally inflate you and bring you up, but it's important to feel buoyant. If you pull yourself up too much, then you can see that's really tense. So that's not helpful. That's really tense. So it's a case of just, well, I say just, I mean it's finding the sending of the weight down onto the sitting bones and then just allowing your natural response to go up, which is what we're all designed to do. It's not easy though.
Thank you.
Virginia.
Yeah, this is kind of related, and maybe I'm changing my opinion as I'm speaking, but when you first described putting your legs straight down in approximately a 90-degree angle, I realized that my legs are farther back, and that's what's helping me hold the vial. And that when I put my legs at a more 90, put my feet more under my knees, I feel like I have to lean forward more to play. But maybe if I pull the vial back, then maybe there's a danger of hitting my knee. I don't know. So and this also has to do with, I mean, should you be like leaning forward a little bit? If you put your knees out, maybe the suggestion that you put your feet closer together is a good thing. And also often like the left leg is in front, which brings the knee down a little bit, which helps with that. I don't know. These are just thoughts and asking for your response.
Yeah, certainly the left foot will, I think, with the base will likely be further forward. I think that's absolutely fine. And as you say, and as Ibby's observed, it will lower your knee a little bit. In terms of how comfortable you feel about holding the vial, I certainly find that I like to. I have got a base, but I won't go and get it. But I like to, if possible, hold the instrument. Actually, I'll go to the side again so you can see. Hold the instrument as close as I can to my upper body, rather than being too far forward. So it's really tucked into the the inside of your upper thighs, and it's if you've got a big base, that might be a bit of a challenge, and obviously sitting as far forward on the chair as you can help. But do you find that your heels come off the floor is the crucial question, I suppose? No,
but I do find that maybe not. I was thinking that when I put my knees further forward, the vial is slipping around more.
Right.
But yeah, if it's back farther, I can kind of bring it around the outside more. I don't know. Maybe not. I have to think about this.
And of course, I've always got my comfort blanket as well.
Oh, yeah.
So strictly speaking, it's not so useful on the base, but I do use it. I keep it draped over my left calf. Find it because of the this side being proud and this side tucked in. I find it really helps. Mm-hmm. That little bit of extra security. So I don't know whether that was helpful, but anyway, those are very useful observations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. I've got a question about talking of comfort. Comfort blanket, comfort pillow, because there is such a thing as a wedge cushion, which you can actually buy from a music shop, especially designed for musicians. Any thoughts on wedge cushions, Susanna?
I've never used one. In fact, we've got one knocking around. I can see it over there. And I suspect what I would find with a wedge is that it would roll my pelvis forward. And that's a bit of a habit I have anyway, because I tend to...
Is that a good thing?
No.
No.
I used to get a lot of lower back pain when I was particularly on the tenor viol, actually. So I've sort of tried to resist that habit and think of trying to really embrace my sitting bones and not try to avoid them by rolling forward. So I think perhaps the wedge, I'm actually going to go and get it, and just experiment and see what it does.
Just while Susanna's doing that, it's probably worth saying that she's on a flat seat, and a lot of modern chairs tip you backwards, which is where the wedge helps to straighten you up again.
Yeah, that's a very good point, John, actually. Yes, definitely a flat seat. That would always be my preference. So a wedge on a flat seat, yeah, definitely my pelvis is being shifted forward and I don't like it. But that's a very good point that John makes, that it can help to counteract a seat that's tipping backwards. But I think on a flat seat I wouldn't use a wedge.
Thank you.
I found the amount of turnout makes a big effect. If my toes point outwards, it helps. And I think Simpson's illustration shows quite a ballet-like turnout. But sometimes I wonder if I do too much.
Well, again, yes, it's as well as thinking in an ideal world that it's nice to have your feet under your knees. It's also quite nice to think of your feet pointing the same direction as your knees. So that might mean I think there is always a little bit more turnout than that involved. I think an extreme turnout might roll, I don't know, it might carry your legs with it, would it? Rolling out from the hip more.
Is that actually, by the way, is that actually a good tip, that the toes point the same direction as the knees? I've not heard that before.
Yeah, I think that as a sort of rough concept, that's a good one. Although in practice, it might not be absolutely possible to do that. You might find they're just, certainly with looking at my left leg, of course you can't see what's going on down here. And you can't see my rainbow coloured socks either. But certainly my left foot is slightly more angled out from the direction of my knee, as I imagine holding a bass viol. When I play the tenor, because of my comfort blanket, I just sit as you would normally. So with my camera's way over there, so I won't get it. But so in that case, yes, my feet are under my knees, and they are going in the same direction as my knees.
Thank you. Elizabeth Dodd. Elizabeth?
Yes, I was just unmuting. I was wondering if you'd like to say something about the head and the neck and height of music stand and that kind of thing.
Yes, that's a good idea. Yes, well, certainly it's ideally we're thinking of our head-neck back relationship and the way we balance our head on the top of all that. And again, I'll go sideways because what as I demonstrated earlier, if we collapse a little bit, you see how that throws the head forward, and now there's an awful lot of weight of head that's having to be supported in a way that isn't balanced. So the effect of that is that the rest of your body will have to compensate for that, and that's when the tension creeps in. And quite often, if you see people who have to peer at their music, and so either get your glasses sorted out, which is certainly what I need to do right now. I'm definitely due a trip to the optician, but also think about, as you say, the height of your music stand. It's very important. I tend to find I make compromises because in concerts I don't want to have the music stand too high because I don't want to block the instruments. So that is an issue if you're performing. But if you're in a consort session, just make sure that you can see the music without having to peer or disturb that head neck balance, which is hopefully keeping you nice and free to move.
Thank you very much. Question from Virginia. What is your comfort blanket made of?
I'm afraid my comfort blanket is made of Spanish leather. It's a good few years old now. My husband brought it back from a trip to Spain and said, "Try this," as I was struggling with holding the treble viol, and it did help enormously, and it's been with me ever since. But cheaper and easier to find alternatives work just as well.
Martin and Sue.
Well, just Martin. Having talked to Zan about inquired about her comfort blanket, I've now acquired my own, which is superb. It's a strip of suede.
Okay.
That works really nicely.
Great. Yes, I mean, a lot of people, and I give my students the shelf liner stuff, which comes in narrow strips. Some people say there might be issues with the varnish on the vial with that. I don't know, so you might want to be a little bit careful. My husband Jake, who's a lutenist, you might know, he's started using, is it called neoprene, the stuff that wetsuits are made of? And apparently that's quite good. And you can get it in different things. I mean, if you get it really thick, then it's very stiff, but you can get thinner grades of it. But he just uses it just to cushion his, him and the lute, so that he's not scratching the back of the lute, and it's not shifting around too much. It's a slightly different use, but still providing a non-stick.
One more question before we go into breakout rooms. Any other questions? No. Well, in that case, I think we can start the breakout rooms. But can we give a round of applause to Susanna, please, for a most interesting session. It's been wonderful. So if you'd like to leave donations, you can do so at the Vero de Gamba Society website. It does help cover the cost of these meetings. Now, let's go into breakout rooms. I'm going to press the button in 30 seconds time. If you do not wish to stay for the chat in the rooms, this is a moment to leave the meeting. So I'm going to press the button in a moment. Here we go.